The desert wind carried dust across the small trading post where Elena Martinez first saw Thomas Crawford. She had come to town with her Apache mother, Morningstar, to trade blankets and pottery for supplies their family needed. Elena stood between two worlds. Her father had been a Mexican trader who died when she was young, and her mother had raised her in the Apache way. Thomas was different from the other white settlers who came through the territory. While most avoided looking at Apache people or spoke with harsh voices, Thomas treated Morningstar with respect. He admired their beautiful pottery and paid fair prices without arguing. Elena noticed how his blue eyes crinkled when he smiled, and how he spoke a few words in Apache that he had learned from other traders. "Your daughter makes beautiful work," Thomas told Morningstar in broken Apache, pointing to Elena's beaded jewelry. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm. She had never heard a white man try to speak their language before, and certainly not to compliment her craftsmanship. Morningstar studied Thomas carefully. She had learned to read white men well after years of trading. Some came with greed in their eyes, wanting to cheat Apache families. Others came with fear, jumping at every sound. But this man seemed different. His hands were steady, his voice calm, and he looked directly at them when he spoke instead of staring at the ground or over their shoulders. "You live near here?" Morningstar asked in English. Thomas nodded and pointed west toward the mountains. "About 10 miles that way. I have a small ranch. Just me and my horses." He paused, then added, "It gets lonely sometimes." Elena understood loneliness. Even among her Apache family, she sometimes felt caught between worlds. The other young Apache women had grown up fully in their traditions, while Elena carried memories of her Mexican father's stories and his different ways of seeing the world. She spoke Spanish and English as well as Apache, and sometimes the older people looked at her strangely when she used words from the other languages. Over the following months, Thomas began coming to the trading post more often. He always had good reasons. He needed supplies or he had extra vegetables from his garden to trade. But Elena noticed that he timed his visits for when her family came to town. He would find excuses to talk with them, asking Morningstar about Apache traditions or complimenting Elena's latest beadwork. "That white man looks at you like a hawk watches a rabbit," her cousin Maria whispered to Elena one day. "But not like he wants to hunt you, like he wants to protect you," Elena had noticed too. When other white men came into the trading post and spoke rudely about Indians, Thomas would step closer to Elena's family. He never started fights, but his presence made the rude men think twice about their words. Once, when a drunk cowboy knocked over Elena's carefully arranged jewelry display, Thomas quickly helped her gather the scattered pieces while staring hard at the cowboy until he apologized. Morningstar watched these interactions with growing interest. She had been married to Elena's father for only 3 years before his death, but those had been good years. He had been a kind man who respected Apache ways while sharing his own traditions. She had learned that love could cross the lines that other people drew between different groups. One evening, as they packed up their goods to return home, Thomas approached them nervously. "Morningstar, I wonder if I might ask you something," he said, mixing Apache and English words together in his careful way. "You may ask," she replied, though Elena could tell her mother already knew what was coming. "I would like permission to visit Elena at your camp, to court her properly, the way your people do these things." His face was red, but his voice stayed steady. "I know I'm not Apache, but I respect your ways. I want to learn more about them." Morningstar looked at Elena, who tried to keep her expression calm even though her heart was beating fast. She had been hoping Thomas would ask, but she was also afraid. Love between Apache women and white men was dangerous. The white settlers often looked down on such relationships, and some Apache people did too. "You know this will not be easy," Morningstar told Thomas. "Many people will not understand. Some will be angry." Thomas nodded seriously. "I know. But Elena is worth facing those troubles. If she'll have me." Elena looked at her mother, then at Thomas. She thought about the loneliness she had seen in his eyes, and the loneliness she felt in her own heart. She thought about how gently he handled her pottery, and how he never spoke down to her mother. She thought about how he tried to learn Apache words, and how he defended them when others were rude. "You may visit," she said quietly, and Thomas's face lit up like sunrise over the mountains. The next few months brought both joy and worry to Elena's life. Thomas visited their camp every week, always bringing gifts and showing respect to Elena's extended family. He learned Apache customs quickly, sitting in the proper place during meals and bringing tobacco to the older men. He helped with work around the camp and listened carefully when the elders told stories. Some of Elena's family welcomed Thomas warmly. Her uncle Running Bear liked that Thomas was a hard worker who didn't put on airs. Her grandmother Sweetwater appreciated that he never interrupted when she was speaking, and always thanked her for meals. The children in the camp followed him around, fascinated by his strange blue eyes and his attempts to speak their language. But others were less welcoming. Elena's cousin John Crow had never trusted white people since soldiers killed his father in a raid years earlier. "White men take what they want and then leave," he warned Elena. "They make promises they don't keep." Elena's Aunt Desert Rose worried about what would happen to Elena if she married a white man. "You will have to live in his world," she told Elena. "White women don't have the respect that Apache women do. They must obey their husbands in all things." These warnings troubled Elena, but when she was with Thomas, her doubts faded. He asked her opinion about everything from where to plant his garden to which horses were worth buying. He was teaching her to read English books, and she was teaching him more Apache words and customs. They would sit by his small cabin in the evenings, talking about their dreams for the future. "I want to raise horses," Thomas told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the desert red and gold. "Good horses that can handle this country, and I want to raise them with you if you'll marry me." Elena's heart soared, but she also felt afraid. Marriage would mean choosing Thomas's world over her family's world in many ways. It would mean facing the anger of white people who hated mixed marriages, and possibly losing some of her Apache family's acceptance too. "I need time to think," she told him, though she already knew what her heart wanted to say. Elena's decision came sooner than she expected, but not in the way she had planned. 3 days after Thomas proposed, a group of angry white settlers rode into the trading post while Elena and Morning Star were there. They had been drinking, and their leader, a man named Jake Morrison, started shouting about Indian troubles in the territory. "These savages are stealing cattle and scaring decent folk," Morrison declared loudly, looking straight at Elena and her mother. "Time to teach them a lesson about staying where they belong." The trading post owner, Mr. Peterson, tried to calm the situation. "Now, Jake, these ladies have never caused any trouble. They're good customers who pay fair prices." But Morrison wasn't listening. He stepped closer to Elena, his breath smelling of whiskey. "Maybe they haven't stolen cattle yet, but they're planning to. I can see it in their sneaky eyes." Elena felt fear and anger mix in her chest. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew that didn't matter to men like Morrison. She also knew that defending herself might make things worse for her family and other Apache people who came to trade. Just then, Thomas walked into the trading post. He took one look at the situation and moved to stand between Elena and Morrison. "Is there a problem here?" he asked in a calm but firm voice. Morrison laughed meanly. "Well, if it isn't the Indian lover, heard you've been sniffing around these people's camp. That's disgusting, Crawford. A white man should know better." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I'd be careful about your words, Morrison. These ladies deserve respect just like any other customers here." "Respect?" Morrison spat on the ground. "The only thing Indians deserve is a bullet or a reservation far away from decent people." Thomas stepped closer to Morrison. "You're drunk and talking nonsense. Go home and sleep it off. Don't tell me what to do." Morrison shoved Thomas hard. "You've gone native, Crawford. Forgot what side you're supposed to be on." Thomas stumbled back but didn't fall. Elena could see anger building in his eyes, but he was trying to stay calm. "There are no sides here, Morrison. Just people trying to get along." Morrison's friends spread out behind him, and Elena realized this was about to become a real fight. She touched Thomas's arm gently. "We should go," she said quietly in Apache. But Morrison heard her speak and got even angrier. Now she's giving orders in her heathen language. "This is America, girl. Speak English or don't speak at all." That was when Thomas's control snapped. He grabbed Morrison by the shirt and pushed him against the wall. "Don't you ever speak to her that way again," he said in a voice so cold it made Elena shiver. Morrison's friends moved forward, but so did some of the other people in the trading post. Mr. Peterson stepped between them with a shotgun. "That's enough. Morrison, you and your boys get out of here before I call the territorial marshal. Thomas, you and the ladies should probably leave too." As they walked outside, Morrison shouted after them, This isn't over, Crawford. You'll regret choosing them over your own kind. Elena's hands shook as they gathered their supplies. She had faced prejudice before, but never such open hatred. Thomas helped them load their wagon, his face dark with anger and worry. I'm sorry you had to see that, he told Morningstar. Not all white people think like Morrison. Morningstar studied Thomas carefully. You stood up for us when it would have been easier to walk away. That shows your heart. During the long ride back to the Apache camp, Elena thought about what had happened. Thomas had risked his safety and his reputation to defend her family. Morrison and his friends would spread the story, and Thomas would face more trouble because of it. Yet he had never hesitated to stand between her and danger. When they reached the camp, news of the confrontation spread quickly. Some of Elena's relatives were angry that Thomas had brought white men's problems to their attention. Others admired that he had defended Apache people when he could have stayed safe by keeping quiet. Running Bear, Elena's uncle, called a family meeting that evening. This changes things, he said seriously. If Elena marries this white man, she will face more trouble like today, and our whole family might face trouble too. Elena's cousin John Crow nodded grimly. White men like Morrison don't forget. They hold grudges and look for revenge. If Elena stays with Thomas, we might all pay the price. But Elena's grandmother, Sweetwater, surprised everyone by speaking up for Thomas. I watched how he acted today. He could have walked away and been safe. Instead, he chose to protect our family. That is the action of a good man, Morningstar agreed. I have seen many white men in my life. Some are good, some are bad, just like Apache men. Thomas showed his heart today. He will face danger for Elena, and she will face danger for him. But that is what love means. Elena listened to her family debate her future, feeling torn between love and loyalty. She knew that marrying Thomas would bring difficulties for everyone she cared about, but she also knew that turning away from love because of other people's hatred would be giving those hateful people power over her life. Finally, she stood up to speak. Thomas did not ask me to choose between him and my family. He has tried to become part of our family while staying true to himself. If I marry him, I will still be Apache. I will still be your daughter, your niece, your granddaughter. I will just also be his wife. The discussion continued late into the night. Some family members remained worried, but most eventually agreed to support Elena's choice. Running Bear summed up the family's decision. If this is what Elena wants, we will stand by her. But Thomas must prove he can protect her from his own people's anger. The next morning, Thomas came to the camp looking worried and tired. Elena could tell he hadn't slept much. I heard what happened yesterday has caused problems for your family, he said to Morningstar. I never wanted to bring you trouble. Trouble was already there, Morningstar replied wisely. You just helped us see it clearly. The question now is what we do about it. Elena took Thomas's hand. My family is willing to accept you as my husband, but only if you can prove you're strong enough to face what's coming. Morrison and his friends won't forget what happened yesterday. Thomas nodded seriously. I know. And I know that marrying you will make both our lives harder. But Elena, I'd rather face difficulties with you than live safely without you. Elena felt her heart swell with love and determination. Then we'll face them together. As word spread through the territory about the trading post confrontation and the upcoming marriage, Elena began to understand just how much courage their love would require. Some white settlers were furious that Thomas was betraying his own race. Some Apache people worried that Elena was abandoning her heritage. But Elena and Thomas decided that their love was worth fighting for, no matter what others thought. They began planning their wedding ceremony, which would blend Apache and white traditions. Thomas would give horses to Elena's family as Apache custom required. Elena would wear both an Apache wedding dress and a white woman's wedding ring. They would have two ceremonies, one in the Apache camp and one in the small church in town for any white friends who would come. But even as they planned their happy future, Elena could feel storm clouds gathering. Morrison's anger hadn't cooled and other settlers were beginning to take sides. The love that had seemed so pure and simple when they first met was about to be tested in ways neither of them had imagined. The troubles began even before Elena and Thomas could hold their wedding ceremonies. Word of their engagement spread through both communities like wildfire, and reactions were swift and harsh. Elena discovered just how divided the world could be when love crossed racial lines. At the general store in town, White women who had always been polite to Elena now turned their backs when she entered. Mrs. Henderson, who used to admire Elena's beadwork, loudly told her friend that mixing races was against God's plan. The store owner still served Elena, but his friendliness was gone, replaced by cold politeness. Even worse was what happened to Thomas. His few white friends began avoiding him, and some started spreading rumors that he had gone savage and couldn't be trusted around decent people. Morrison and his followers made it clear they considered Thomas a traitor to his own race. One evening, Thomas came to the Apache camp with worry written across his face. "They're trying to force me off my land," he told Elena and her family. "Morrison convinced the bank that I'm too risky for my loan. They want full payment in 30 days or they'll take my ranch." Running Bear frowned deeply. This is how white men fight when they can't use guns openly. They use their laws and their money as weapons. Elena felt sick with guilt. Thomas was losing everything because of his love for her. "Maybe we should wait," she said quietly. "Maybe if we postpone the wedding, they'll leave you alone." Thomas took her hands in his. "Elena, they're not doing this just because we're getting married. They're doing this because they hate that an Apache woman and a white man could love each other as equals. If we give in now, we're telling them that their hatred is stronger than our love." Morningstar nodded approvingly. "A man who runs from one fight will face many more fights. A man who stands firm sometimes finds that bullies look for easier targets. But standing firm proved more dangerous than any of them expected." 3 nights later, Elena woke to the sound of horses approaching the camp. She looked out of her family's wickiup and saw torches moving in the darkness. Her blood turned cold as she realized what was happening. "Raiders!" she whispered urgently, shaking her mother awake. Throughout the camp, Apache families were quietly preparing for trouble. The men grabbed their weapons while the women gathered the children into the safest spots. Morrison's voice carried across the desert air. "We know the Indian lover is in there somewhere. Send him out and nobody gets hurt." Running Bear stepped forward into the firelight, his rifle ready but pointed at the ground. "Thomas Crawford is not here. This is an Apache camp. You have no business here, don't lie to us," Morrison shouted back. "We saw his horse tracks leading this way. We're going to teach him what happens to white men who forget their place." Elena's heart pounded as she realized Thomas must have ridden out to check his cattle and taken a route that led past their camp. He was probably miles away, but his horse tracks had given Morrison an excuse to terrorize her family. "Search the camp," Morrison ordered his men. "Turn over every tent until you find him." "No," Running Bear said firmly, raising his rifle. "You will not touch our homes or our families. Thomas Crawford is not here, and even if he was, we would not give him to a drunk mob." For a tense moment, Elena thought shooting would start. The Apache men were outnumbered, but they knew the terrain and they were fighting to protect their families. Morrison's men were brave enough when they had overwhelming odds, but facing determined Apache warriors in the darkness was different from bullying people at a trading post. Finally, Morrison seemed to realize that attacking the Apache camp would bring more trouble than he wanted. "This isn't over," he yelled. "Tell your Indian-loving friend that we'll be watching for him." The raiders rode away, but Elena knew this was just the beginning. Morrison had shown that he was willing to threaten an entire Apache family to get at Thomas. He had also shown that he didn't care about the difference between Apache people and Thomas. In his mind, they were all enemies. The next morning brought even worse news. Thomas rode into camp with his face grim and his clothes torn. "They burned my barn," he reported. "Killed 3 of my horses and scattered the rest. Left a note saying it was just the start." Elena felt tears sting her eyes. Thomas had worked for years to build his ranch, and now Morrison was destroying it piece by piece. "How can they get away with this?" she asked. "Because the law doesn't protect people like us," Thomas said bitterly. "The territorial marshal is Morrison's cousin. The bank president goes to Morrison's church. They've got this whole territory sewn up." Running Bear studied Thomas carefully. "What will you do now? Will you fight back or will you leave?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Elena could see him struggling with anger, fear, and determination. Finally, he looked up at her family. "I won't run away, but I also won't let them hurt Elena's family because of me. Maybe I should stay away from the camp for a while." "No," Elena said firmly. "If you stay away, they win. If we let them scare us apart, we're giving them exactly what they want." Morningstar agreed. "Fear is like a hungry animal. The more you feed it, the stronger it gets. We must not feed their fear with our fear." But Elena's cousin John Crow disagreed. This is bigger than just Elena and Thomas now. Morrison is using their marriage as an excuse to threaten our whole family. Maybe it would be better if they waited until things calmed down. Elena felt angry tears burning in her eyes. Things won't calm down, John. Men like Morrison don't give up just because we wait. They get braver when they think they're winning. That evening, Elena and Thomas walked away from the camp to talk privately. The desert stretched around them under a canopy of stars, beautiful and peaceful in a way that made the human hatred seem even more ugly. Are you having second thoughts? Thomas asked gently. I would understand if you were. This is more than you should have to face. Elena looked at him in the starlight. His face was bruised from the fight at his ranch, and his eyes were sad with the weight of everything they were facing. But she could also see his love for her, steady and strong despite all the troubles. I'm not having second thoughts about loving you, she said, but I am scared about what's going to happen to all of us.
My family is in danger because of me.
You're losing everything you worked for. Sometimes love feels selfish when it costs so much. Thomas pulled her into his arms. Elena, do you know what I thought about when I was fighting those men at my ranch? I thought about how Morrison wants us to believe that love between different kinds of people is wrong. He wants us to think that Apache people and white people can't live together peacefully. If we give up, we're proving him right. Elena rested her head against Thomas's chest and listened to his heartbeat. She thought about her father, who had been Mexican, and her mother, who was Apache. Their love had been brief, but real, and it had created Elena. She was living proof that love could cross the lines that other people drew. What if we get married right away? She said suddenly. Not the big ceremony we planned, but just a simple Apache wedding. Once we're married, maybe some people will accept that it's done and stop fighting it. Thomas considered this. Or maybe it will make them even angrier. But Elena, I'm ready to marry you tomorrow if that's what you want. I'm ready to face whatever comes as your husband. Elena felt a surge of love and determination. Then let's do it. Let's get married and show everyone that their hatred can't stop our love. As they walked back to the camp hand in hand, Elena felt both afraid and hopeful. She knew the troubles were far from over. Morrison and his followers would probably get more dangerous once she and Thomas were actually married. But she also knew that she and Thomas were stronger together than apart, and that her Apache family would stand by them no matter what came next. The next morning, Elena told her family about their decision to marry immediately. Some relatives were worried about the rush, but most understood that waiting would only give their enemies more time to cause trouble. If you're going to face this storm, Sweetwater said wisely, better to face it as husband and wife than as two people who might be torn apart. The Apache wedding ceremony took place at dawn, when the desert air was cool and the morning star still glowed in the lightening sky. Elena wore her grandmother's wedding dress, made of soft deerskin and decorated with turquoise beads that caught the early sunlight. Thomas wore a shirt that Elena's mother had made for him, combining Apache designs with his own people's style. Running Bear conducted the ceremony in the Apache tradition. Thomas gave 4 horses to Elena's family, showing that he understood Apache customs and was willing to provide for his wife. Elena gave Thomas a blanket she had woven herself, symbolizing that she would keep their home warm and welcoming. They shared corn pollen and sacred water, binding their lives together in the eyes of the Apache people. As the sun rose fully over the desert, Elena and Thomas were officially husband and wife. The small gathering of family members sang traditional songs and shared a feast that Morningstar had prepared. For a few hours, surrounded by people who loved them, Elena and Thomas could almost forget about the dangers waiting beyond the camp. But reality returned quickly. That afternoon, a neighbor of Thomas's named Pete Wilson rode out to warn them. Morrison's gathering more men, Pete said quietly. He was one of the few white settlers who didn't share Morrison's hatred. He's telling everyone that Apache raiders attacked his ranch and stole cattle. Says he has proof it was Elena's family. Elena felt her stomach drop. That's a lie. My family has been here for days. We haven't been anywhere near Morrison's land. Pete nodded. I know that and you know that, but Morrison's got people believing him. He's planning to ride out here tomorrow with a big group. Says he's going to arrest the cattle thieves and anyone who's hiding them. Thomas's face darkened. He's using the marriage as an excuse to attack Elena's family. He thinks if he can drive them away or hurt them, I'll leave too. Running Bear called an emergency council of the Apache families. The adults gathered in a circle as the sun began to set, their faces serious in the firelight. Elena sat between Thomas and her mother, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Morrison is coming with many men, Running Bear announced. He claims we stole his cattle. But this is really about Elena's marriage to Thomas. He wants to punish all of us for accepting a white man into our family. John Crow spoke up angrily. I warned everyone this would happen. Now Morrison has an excuse to attack us and the white law will be on his side. They always believe white men over Apache people. So what do you suggest? Asked Desert Rose, and should we run away? Should we send Thomas away? Should we pretend the marriage never happened? Elena couldn't stay quiet any longer. She stood up, feeling all eyes turned to her. I brought this trouble to our family and I'm sorry for that. But running away won't solve anything. Morrison hates Apache people whether I marry Thomas or not. If we run from this fight, he'll know he can scare us anytime he wants. Thomas stood beside his new wife. Elena's right. Morrison is using our marriage as an excuse, but his real goal is to drive Apache families out of this territory. He wants your land and your water rights. Fighting us is just practice for fighting all of you. Sweetwater, the eldest woman in the group, spoke with the authority of her years. I have lived through many troubles. I have seen what happens when people give in to bullies, and I have seen what happens when they stand firm. Sometimes standing firm is dangerous, but giving in is always dangerous. The council debated late into the night. Some wanted to avoid the fight by temporarily moving the camp. Others wanted to send word to other Apache bands for help. But gradually, most agreed with Elena and Thomas. Running would only encourage Morrison to cause more trouble later. Finally, Running Bear announced the decision. We will not run. We will not hide. But we will also not give Morrison an excuse to claim we attacked first. We will defend our camp if he comes, but we will not ride out to meet him. Elena felt proud of her family's courage, but also terrified of what tomorrow might bring. That night, as she lay in Thomas's arms in their small tent, she could hear the men checking weapons and the women packing valuables in case they needed to flee quickly. Are you sorry you married me? Thomas asked quietly in the darkness. Elena turned to face him. Never. Are you sorry you married an Apache woman who comes with Apache troubles? Thomas kissed her forehead. I knew what I was choosing when I chose you. Apache troubles, white troubles, it doesn't matter. We'll face them together. Dawn came too soon. Elena woke to the sound of horses approaching. Many horses. She and Thomas quickly dressed and stepped outside their tent to see Morrison, and at least 20 men riding toward the camp. Some carried rifles, others had ropes, and all looked angry and determined. Morrison stopped his horse just outside the camp's edge. We're here for the cattle thieves,
he shouted.
We know you've got stolen animals hidden somewhere, and we know you've got a white trader helping you. Running Bear walked forward calmly, showing no fear despite being badly outnumbered. You are not welcome here, Morrison. This is Apache land, and we have stolen nothing from you. Don't lie to me. Morrison's face was red with anger. We found tracks leading from my ranch straight to your camp. Apache tracks and white man tracks together. Elena realized what had happened. Thomas had ridden past Morrison's ranch on his way to visit the camp several times. Morrison had used those innocent tracks to create his false story about cattle theft. Thomas stepped forward to stand beside Running Bear. Morrison, you know those were my tracks. I ride past your land to visit my wife's family. That doesn't make me a cattle thief. Morrison's men murmured angrily at the word wife. The sight of Thomas openly claiming Elena as his spouse seemed to enrage them even more. So you admit it, Morrison shouted triumphantly. You admit you've been sneaking around with these savages, probably planning raids on decent folks' property. I admit I married Elena Martinez yesterday in an Apache ceremony, Thomas said firmly. And I'm proud to call her family my family. Several of Morrison's men raised their rifles at this open defiance. Elena felt her heart stop as she realized how close they all were to violence. But then something unexpected happened. Pete Wilson rode up behind Morrison's group, and he wasn't alone. He had brought 6 other white settlers, men who Elena recognized as neighbors of Thomas's who had always been fair in their dealings with Apache people. What's going on here, Morrison? Pete called out. You said you were forming a posse to catch cattle thieves, not to threaten a family camp. Morrison turned angrily toward Pete. These Indians have been stealing my cattle, and that traitor Crawford has been helping them. Pete rode closer, studying the camp. I don't see any cattle here, Morrison. I see families with children, not a gang of raiders. Maybe you should take your accusations to the territorial marshal instead of threatening people with guns. The marshal will just protect his Indian-loving friends. Morrison spat. Sometimes decent people have to take justice into their own hands. But Pete's presence had changed the situation. Morrison's followers were brave enough to threaten an isolated Apache camp, but they weren't eager to fight in front of other white witnesses who might testify against them later. Elena felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe Thomas was right that not all white people shared Morrison's hatred. Maybe there were enough decent people to prevent the worst violence. Then Morrison made his final threat. You've got 1 week, Crawford. 1 week to come to your senses and leave this territory. After that, we won't be responsible for what happens to you or your Indian friends. As Morrison and his men rode away, Elena realized that they had won this battle but not the war. Morrison had backed down in front of witnesses, but he would be looking for another chance to strike when no one was watching. The week following Morrison's threat passed slowly, filled with tension and preparation. Elena's Apache family took turns standing guard around the camp, while Thomas spent his days trying to salvage what he could from his damaged ranch. But everyone knew Morrison wasn't finished with them. Elena found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. The shy young woman who had once avoided confrontation was becoming fierce in protecting her family and her marriage. When white women in town whispered cruel things about her, she held her head high and stared back at them calmly. When Apache people from other bands questioned whether she was betraying her heritage by marrying a white man, she spoke eloquently about love crossing all boundaries. "You're becoming a warrior," her mother observed one evening as they prepared dinner together, "not with weapons but with words and courage." Elena smiled sadly. "I never wanted to be a warrior. I just wanted to make beautiful things and live peacefully." "Sometimes peace requires fighting for it," Morningstar replied wisely. "Your grandmother Sweetwater fought soldiers when she was young. I fought prejudice when I married your Mexican father. Now you fight hatred with love. Each generation has its battles. Thomas was changing too. The gentle rancher who had once avoided conflict was learning to stand firm against threats." But Elena worried about the hardness she sometimes saw in his eyes now. Morrison's attacks were teaching Thomas that the world could be crueler than he had imagined. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Elena and Thomas were both in town buying supplies. They had learned to shop quickly and leave before trouble could find them, but this time they weren't fast enough. Morrison appeared in the doorway of the general store with 3 of his men. His face was flushed with drink even though it was still morning, and Elena could smell the whiskey on him from across the room. Well, Morrison sneered. "Look what we have here. The Indian princess and her pet white man, still pretending they belong in civilized society." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Elena. "We're not looking for trouble, Morrison. We're just buying supplies and leaving." "Oh, but I think you are looking for trouble," Morrison said, moving closer. "I think you've been looking for trouble ever since you decided to disgrace your own race by marrying a savage." Elena felt anger flare in her chest, but she knew that reacting would only make things worse. She tried to move toward the door, hoping they could leave before the situation escalated. But Morrison's men blocked their path. "Not so fast, Princess. My boys and I have been wondering what it is about Indian women that makes white men forget their duty to their own kind." Elena saw Thomas's hands clench into fists, and she knew he was about to do something that would give Morrison an excuse for violence. She quickly placed her hand on Thomas's arm and spoke directly to Morrison herself. "We have done nothing to you," she said in clear, calm English. "We pay our bills, we follow the law, and we treat everyone with respect. If that threatens you, the problem is in your heart, not in our actions." Morrison's face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare lecture me, you half-breed witch. You think you're better than decent white women because you trapped one of our men with your savage tricks." "That's enough." Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "You can insult me all you want, Morrison, but I won't let you speak to my wife that way." "Your wife?" Morrison laughed nastily. "You mean your squaw? That's not a real marriage, Crawford. That's just you playing Indian until you get tired of the game." Elena felt the words hit her like physical blows. She had heard whispers of such attitudes before, but never stated so cruelly to her face. The implication that her Apache marriage wasn't real, that her love with Thomas was just temporary amusement for him, cut deeper than she had expected. But instead of showing hurt, Elena lifted her chin proudly. "I am Elena Crawford now. married in Apache ceremony and before God. If you don't recognize Apache marriage, that shows your ignorance. Not any fault in my husband or myself. Morrison's men laughed at her formal speech, but Elena noticed that some other people in the store were watching with interest rather than hostility. A few women even looked sympathetic to Elena's dignity under attack. Listen to her talk, Morrison mocked. Think she's a real lady now. But everyone knows what you really are, girl. You're just another Indian trying to get above your station. And you're just a drunk bully trying to make yourself feel important by hurting people smaller than yourself. Elena replied steadily. Which one of us is behaving like a civilized person? The store fell silent. Elena's words had turned Morrison's own language against him. By staying calm and speaking intelligently while Morrison ranted drunkenly, she was showing everyone present who really deserved respect. Morrison realized he was losing face in front of the crowd. His red face got redder, and Elena could see him working up to real violence. You think you're so smart, he snarled. Let's see how smart you feel when your whole Apache family is run out of this territory. Is that a threat? Asked a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Pete Wilson entering the store with two other men Elena didn't recognize. Morrison straightened up, suddenly looking less confident. Just stating facts, Wilson. Indians who don't know their place tend to find themselves unwelcome around decent folks. Seems to me the only person being unwelcome here is you, Pete replied mildly. These folks are trying to shop peacefully while you're drunk and looking for a fight before noon. One of the men with Pete stepped forward. Elena saw a badge on his shirt and realized he was some kind of lawman. I'm Deputy Marshal Stevens from the territorial capital, he announced. I've been hearing reports about troubles in this area. Maybe you gentlemen would like to explain what's going on here. Morrison's confidence cracked completely. He had expected to terrorize Elena and Thomas without witnesses, but now he faced a federal marshal and several disapproving townspeople. Just a misunderstanding. Marshal, Morrison said, suddenly trying to sound reasonable. These folks and I have had some disagreements, but nothing that can't be worked out peacefully. Elena saw her chance to speak to real authority. Marshal Stevens, this man has threatened my family repeatedly. He burned my husband's barn and killed his horses. He came to our Apache camp with armed men, claiming we stole cattle but offering no proof. He has been trying to drive us from our home through intimidation and violence. The marshal looked Morrison up and down, clearly unimpressed by what he saw. That's serious accusations, ma'am. Morrison, you want to tell me your side? Morrison fumbled for words, realizing that his lies about cattle theft sounded weak when he had to tell them to a federal officer. Well, there have been some property disputes and cultural misunderstandings. Cultural misunderstandings? Elena interrupted. You mean like when you called me a savage and said my marriage isn't real? Or when you threatened to burn down my family's camp? Pete Wilson nodded confirmation. Marshal, I've seen Morrison and his men harassing these people for weeks. They're good folks who don't cause trouble. But Morrison seems to think their mixed marriage is his business to stop. Marshal Stevens looked around the store, noting the divided reactions of the townspeople. Some clearly supported Morrison, but others looked uncomfortable with his methods, even if they didn't approve of Elena and Thomas's marriage. Here's what's going to happen, the marshal announced firmly. Morrison, you and your men are going to leave these people alone. No more threatening their family, no more destroying their property, no more public harassment. If I hear about any more trouble, I'll be back with a full investigation and federal charges. Morrison started to protest, but Stevens cut him off. And if anyone else in this town thinks they can take the law into their own hands, they can think again. Apache people have the same rights as any other citizens, and mixed marriages are legal under territorial law whether you like them or not. Elena felt a surge of hope and relief. Finally, someone with real authority was standing up for her family's rights, but she also saw the murderous look in Morrison's eyes and knew that legal protection might not be enough if he decided to act in secret. As Morrison and his men slunk out of the store, Elena thanked the marshal and Pete Wilson for their support. But Thomas looked worried rather than relieved. What's wrong? Elena asked as they loaded their supplies into their wagon. The marshal made it clear that Morrison has to leave us alone now. Morrison doesn't care about federal marshals when they're not around to see what he does, Thomas replied grimly. That man just lost face in front of the whole town. He's going to want revenge more than ever now. Elena felt her brief hope fade. She was learning that justice and law were not always the same thing. especially when hatred ran deep enough. Morrison might not dare attack them openly now, but Elena feared he would find other ways to strike back. That night, as she and Thomas returned to the Apache camp, Elena told her family about the confrontation in town. The adults listened gravely to her account of Morrison's threats and the marshal's intervention. "The marshal's words are good," Running Bear said thoughtfully, "but Morrison's actions will matter more than the marshal's words. We must be more careful now. A man who has been shamed in public becomes like a wounded animal, more dangerous because he is desperate." Elena realized that her marriage to Thomas had become about much more than their personal love. It had become a test of whether Apache people and white people could truly live together as equals, whether the law would protect mixed families, and whether love could survive in the face of organized hatred. As she lay in Thomas's arms that night, Elena whispered, "Sometimes I wonder if we're asking for too much. Maybe the world isn't ready for Apache and white people to be one family." Thomas held her tighter. "Elena, if we give up on our love because other people aren't ready for it, then they win. Sometimes people have to see love working before they believe it can work. Maybe we're not just fighting for ourselves. Maybe we're fighting for other couples who will come after us." Elena's fears about Morrison's revenge proved correct, but the attack came in a way none of them expected. Instead of direct violence, Morrison began a campaign of lies and legal manipulation that was harder to fight than bullets. First, he spread stories throughout the territory that Elena's family was harboring army deserters and selling weapons to hostile Apache bands. These lies reached the ears of military commanders, who sent scouts to investigate the camp. Though the soldiers found no evidence of wrongdoing, their presence frightened some of the Apache families and made others suspicious of Elena's white husband. Then Morrison convinced several storekeepers to refuse service to Elena and Thomas. He told them that serving Indian sympathizers would hurt their business with decent white customers. Elena found herself unable to buy basic supplies in 3 different towns, forcing her to travel much farther for necessities. Worst of all, Morrison used his connections with the Territorial Land Office to challenge Thomas's legal claim to his ranch. He produced fake documents suggesting that Thomas had obtained his land through fraud, and demanded that the property be seized and sold to legitimate settlers. Though the claims were false, fighting them in court would take months and cost money that Thomas didn't have. "They're trying to strangle us slowly," Thomas told Elena one evening as they sat outside their tent, watching the sunset paint the desert red and gold. "Morrison knows he can't attack us openly anymore, so he's destroying everything we need to survive." Elena felt exhausted by the constant pressure. Every day brought new problems. People refusing to trade with her family, officials asking suspicious questions, neighbors turning unfriendly. The simple love that had brought her and Thomas together was being tested by forces much larger than themselves. "Maybe John Crow was right," she said quietly. "Maybe this marriage brings too much trouble to too many people. My family is suffering because of me. You're losing your ranch because of me. Sometimes love feels selfish when it costs so much." Thomas took her hand gently. "Elena, do you remember what your grandmother said about fear being like a hungry animal? Morrison is feeding our fear by making us think we're alone and helpless, but we're not alone." As if to prove his point, riders approached the camp in the gathering darkness. Elena tensed, fearing another confrontation, but relaxed when she recognized Pete Wilson's voice calling out friendly greetings. Pete brought surprising news. "There's been some changes in town," he told Elena's family as they gathered around the fire. "Marshal Stevens left word with some of us to keep an eye on Morrison and report any more harassment. But more than that, people are starting to talk about how Morrison's been acting." Elena looked up hopefully. "What kind of talk?" "Well, Mrs. Henderson at the general store told her husband that Morrison's behavior was getting out of hand. She said even if she didn't approve of mixed marriages, she didn't approve of grown men terrorizing women and families either. And Judge Patterson sent word that he's looking into Morrison's land claims against Thomas. Seems he thinks some of the documents might be forged." Running Bear leaned forward with interest. "Are you saying some white people are beginning to side with us?" Pete nodded slowly. "Not all, maybe not even most. But some folks are getting uncomfortable with Morrison's methods, even if they share his opinions about racial mixing. There's a difference between disapproving of something and destroying people's lives over it." Elena felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. Maybe their love story was having the effect Thomas had hoped for. showing people that Apache and white families could live together peacefully, and that the real threat to community peace came from hatred, not from love. But Pete's next words brought the hope back down to earth. The thing is, Morrison knows he's losing support among reasonable people. That makes him more dangerous, not less. Desperate men do desperate things. Pete's warning proved accurate. 2 nights later, Elena woke to the smell of smoke. She rushed outside to see flames rising from Thomas's ranch in the distance. The barn Morrison had burned before was being rebuilt, but now the main house was on fire. Thomas saw it too and immediately saddled his horse. "I have to go," he told Elena urgently. "Maybe I can save something." "It's a trap," Elena said, fear making her voice sharp. "Morrison is hoping you'll ride out there alone so he can attack you without witnesses." Thomas paused, knowing she was right. But Elena could see the pain in his eyes as he watched his home burn. Everything he had worked years to build was going up in flames while he stood helpless. "I'll go with you," Elena decided, "and we'll bring others. Morrison won't dare attack a group." Within minutes, Thomas, Elena, and 4 Apache warriors were riding hard toward the blazing ranch. As they got closer, Elena could see that the fire was too far advanced to save the house. But something else caught her attention. More riders coming from the opposite direction. For a moment, Elena feared it was Morrison coming to finish what he had started. But as the riders got closer, she recognized Pete Wilson and several other white men she had met in town. They weren't coming to attack, they were coming to help. Pete rode up to Thomas as they all stared at the burning house. "I'm sorry, Thomas. We got here as fast as we could when we saw the smoke, but there was nothing to be done." Thomas's voice was thick with grief and anger. "Everything I owned was in that house. My parents' pictures, my books, everything." Elena felt tears sting her eyes. Morrison had taken more than just a building. He had destroyed Thomas's connections to his past, his memories, his sense of having a place in the world. But then Pete surprised them again. "Thomas, I've been talking with some of the other ranchers. We know Morrison did this even if we can't prove it. And we know he did it because you married Elena. Most of us don't have strong feelings one way or the other about mixed marriages. But we all have strong feelings about a man who burns down his neighbors' homes." Another white settler, Jim Carter, nodded agreement. "Morrison's gone too far this time. Threatening people is one thing, but arson is another. We can't let him think he can burn down anyone who disagrees with him." Elena looked around at the group of white and Apache men standing together in the flickering firelight. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like she and Thomas weren't fighting alone. "What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked. "We're suggesting it's time to make a stand," Pete replied firmly. "Morrison has been terrorizing this whole territory, using your marriage as an excuse. But most folks are getting tired of his bullying. If we all stand together, white and Apache, he won't be able to pick us off one by one." Running Bear spoke up from horseback. "You would stand with Apache people against a white man? Even though you disapprove of the marriage?" Jim Carter shrugged. "I'm not sure what I think about the marriage, but I know what I think about men who burn down houses and threaten families. Morrison's behavior is making him the real threat to peace around here." Elena felt a strange mixture of hope and sadness. It was encouraging to know that some white people would defend her family's right to exist peacefully, even if they didn't approve of her choices. But it was also sad that it had taken Morrison's extreme violence to make them see that love was less dangerous than hatred. As the house burned down to ashes, Elena and Thomas faced a decision. They could give up, admit that the world wasn't ready for their kind of love, and go their separate ways. Or they could rebuild, with the help of people who were beginning to understand that accepting differences was less dangerous than destroying them. "We'll rebuild," Thomas decided, looking at Elena for confirmation. "We'll rebuild bigger and stronger than before, and we'll build it with help from both our families, Apache and white." Elena nodded, feeling her warrior spirit returning. "Morrison can burn down our house, but he can't burn down our love or our determination. If he wants a war, he'll get one. But he'll be fighting against united families, not divided ones." As they rode back to the Apache camp, Elena realized that their love story had become something bigger than just 2 people choosing each other. It had become a story about what kind of community they all wanted to live in, one based on fear and hatred, or one based on acceptance and mutual respect. The real test was still coming, but now Elena felt ready to face it with allies she had never expected to find. The final confrontation came at dawn on a cold December morning, 6 months after Elena and Thomas had married. Morrison had spent weeks gathering men from across the territory, not just local settlers, but drifters, outlaws, and anyone else who could be paid or convinced to join his cause. He had nearly 50 armed men when he rode toward the site where Thomas was rebuilding his ranch. But Morrison had made a critical mistake. He assumed that Elena and Thomas were still fighting alone, still isolated by prejudice and fear. He didn't realize that their love story had slowly changed the hearts and minds of people throughout the territory. Elena woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of many horses approaching. Her first thought was terror. Morrison had finally come with enough men to overwhelm any defense. But as she looked out from the temporary shelter where she and Thomas had been living while rebuilding, she saw something that made her heart soar. The riders approaching weren't Morrison's men. They were friends and allies. Pete Wilson led a group of 20 white settlers who had decided that Morrison's reign of terror had to end. Behind them rode Running Bear and 30 Apache warriors from 3 different bands who had come to defend Elena's family. And bringing up the rear was Deputy Marshal Stevens with a squad of federal soldiers. Thomas emerged from the shelter, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's happening?" he asked. "I think," Elena said with wonder in her voice, "we're about to find out whether love really is stronger than hate." Pete Wilson dismounted and approached them quickly. "Morrison's coming with a big force," he reported. "He's been telling people that Apache raiders have been attacking white settlements and that you two are the leaders of some kind of uprising. It's all lies, but he's got enough desperate men believing him to cause real trouble." Running Bear joined them, his face grim but determined. "Morrison has made this about more than just your marriage. He's trying to start a war between Apache people and white people. If he succeeds, many innocent families will suffer." Marshal Stevens approached with official authority. "I've got word from the territorial governor that this ends today. Morrison's been spreading his lies all the way to the capital, but we've investigated his claims and found no evidence of Apache raids or uprising. He's the one breaking the law now." Elena felt overwhelmed by the support surrounding her, but also afraid of what was about to happen. So many good people were preparing to risk their lives because she and Thomas had dared to love each other across racial lines. "Maybe Thomas and I should just leave," she said quietly. "Go somewhere far away where our marriage won't cause trouble for anyone else." "No," said a firm voice behind her. Elena turned to see her grandmother, Sweetwater, approaching with several other Apache women. Running away teaches bullies that their threats work. Standing firm teaches them that love is stronger than fear. As the sun began to rise, Morrison's force appeared on the horizon, a dark line of riders silhouetted against the orange sky. Even from a distance, Elena could see that Pete had been right about the numbers. Morrison had gathered a small army, but the sight of the defenders waiting at Thomas's ranch clearly surprised Morrison. He had expected to find a vulnerable couple hiding with a few Apache relatives. Instead, he found Apache warriors and white settlers standing together, backed by federal authority. Morrison rode forward with a few of his men, staying just out of rifle range. "Stevens," he shouted, "what are you doing here?" "I told you we were dealing with Apache raiders." "I don't see any raiders, Morrison," the marshal called back. "I see families defending their homes from a mob." "Those aren't families." Morrison's voice carried clearly in the cold morning air. "That's a white trader who's forgotten his own race and a bunch of savages who think they can live like civilized people." Elena felt Thomas tense beside her at the insults, but Pete Wilson stepped forward to answer. "Morrison, the only person here who's forgotten how to act civilized is you. These folks have been living peacefully while you've been burning buildings and threatening children." Several of Morrison's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Elena realized that many of them had joined Morrison's crusade believing his lies about Apache raids and uprisings. Seeing Apache and white families standing together peacefully was probably not what they had expected. Morrison seemed to realize he was losing control of his followers. "Don't let them fool you!" he shouted desperately. "This is exactly how it starts. First they allow race mixing, then they let the Indians think they're equal to white people, then before you know it, we're all living under savage rule." "The only savage rule I see here is yours, Morrison," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see Judge Patterson riding up with several prominent townsmen. "I've finished investigating your land claims against Thomas Crawford, and I found exactly what I expected: forged documents and false testimony. Elena watched Morrison's face turn pale as his legal manipulations were exposed publicly. But instead of backing down, he seemed to become more desperate and dangerous. "You're all against me," Morrison screamed. "You've all been corrupted by Indian lovers and race traders. But I won't let you destroy this territory." Elena saw Morrison's hand move toward his gun, and she realized that the man had finally snapped completely. Years of hatred had driven him beyond reason, and he was about to start shooting regardless of the consequences. But before Morrison could draw his weapon, something unexpected happened. Several of his own men turned their horses and began riding away. Others lowered their rifles and raised their hands in surrender. Only his closest followers, perhaps 10 men out of the original 50, remained loyal to his cause. "Morrison," Marshal Stevens called out with authority, "you're under arrest for arson, making false legal claims and inciting violence. Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial." For a moment, Elena thought Morrison might actually give up. His support had crumbled, his lies had been exposed, and he was facing federal charges. A reasonable man would have surrendered, but Morrison was no longer reasonable. With a wild yell, he drew his gun and spurred his horse toward Elena and Thomas. His remaining followers charged behind him, choosing violence over surrender. The battle was brief but intense. Apache warriors and white settlers fought side by side to protect the families they had come to defend. Federal soldiers moved with professional efficiency to restore order. Elena found herself crouched behind a wagon with Thomas's arms around her, listening to the crack of rifles and the shouts of men. When the shooting stopped, Morrison lay dead in the dirt, killed not by Apache bullets but by a shot from Pete Wilson's rifle when Morrison had aimed at Elena. 3 of his followers were wounded, and the rest had surrendered. Elena emerged from cover to see something remarkable. Apache and white people were helping each other tend wounds and calm frightened horses. The artificial divisions that Morrison had tried to enforce with violence were dissolving in the face of shared humanity. "Is it over?" Elena asked Marshal Stevens as he supervised the arrest of Morrison's remaining followers. "This part is over," Stevens replied. "But the real work is just beginning. You and Thomas have shown people that love can cross racial lines. Now everyone has to decide what kind of community they want to build, one based on Morrison's hatred, or one based on what they saw here today." In the months that followed, Elena and Thomas rebuilt their ranch with help from both Apache and white families. Their home became a place where people from different backgrounds could meet, trade, and learn from each other. Some settlers remained prejudiced, and some Apache people remained suspicious, but enough people on both sides had seen the power of cooperation to make real change possible. Elena gave birth to their first child 2 years later, a daughter they named Hope. As Elena held her baby and looked out at the ranch where Apache children played with white children while their parents worked together, she realized that their love story had become something much bigger than just 2 people choosing each other. They had proven that love really could be stronger than hate, that different peoples really could live together as one community, and that standing firm against bullies really could change the world. Morrison's fury had been fierce, but it had not been able to destroy what love had built. Elena smiled as she watched Thomas teaching Apache children to read English, while Apache elders taught white children traditional stories. Their daughter would grow up in a world where such cooperation was normal, where love crossing racial lines was accepted, and where families like theirs could live in peace. The desert wind carried the sound of laughter across the ranch, Apache laughter and white laughter mixing together like the colors of a sunset. Elena had faced Morrison's fury for Thomas, but in the end, it was their Apache and white families surrounding their homestead that had made their love story into a victory for everyone.